And there's still, Joseph comes before the Exodus, but I put him after the Exodus. I don't know if Hunter had any more or not.
Who else needs a Joe? I just got one more.
Need one here for Rebecca.
She got one.
Okay. All right.
Here's a couple more. Who needs it? Going once?
Twice.
It's yours. I can't read.
Oh.
These are just basically maps that we've already covered 99% of the material. So if you want to mark out the paths of the different journeys, then you're more than welcome to. I'll leave the map up there for just a moment so that you can make your mark. Of course, Laura will have to do it in about 10 different colors. Where did God first call Abraham? Ur of the Chaldees. And he goes from there to where? Haran. And he spends time there. After his father dies, they move out. They go down from Damascus to Shechem. Shechem to Bethel. Hebron to Beersheba, and then into Egypt and back home to Canaan. And we covered all of the stories there, how he got himself into trouble when he went into Egypt, lying about who his wife really was, trying to say it was his sister. It goes to show that God uses imperfect people to do some pretty powerful things during the Old Testament, and I think that he can use us who are imperfect to do some pretty amazing things if we would just get on the same program as he's on. You know, I've been thinking about the Great Commission and how that Jesus said to go into all the world. I wonder how it was that 12 men would have looked at that to begin with and wondered, how can we, just 12 men, do this? And yet within the lifetime of most of those 12 men that he was talking to, they'd already covered all of the world at that time. What a wonderful, wonderful thing. Just the day of Pentecost. Look at all of the different nations that were there that went home and started churches. So God can do, when God tells us to do something, we shouldn't doubt that he's going to give us whatever tools we need to do what it is that he says. So don't ever doubt that God can do great things. All right, y'all got your map part done? All right. This one's a little more difficult. I hope y'all can see that. I can't see that from here on the back wall at all. And if you'd like it, does your map have it already drawn out? Okay, that's what I thought, because it was so convoluted. Now, do y'all believe that they crossed the Red Sea at the point where we see there, or do you think it was further on down at a wider spot? I do too. I think it had to be for it to take that long to get across. And as big as that was. Yes. So it couldn't have been just a little wade across the place. It had to be a big, several miles wide.
Plus, would that just be the way God would do it anyway?
Yeah. He would want to impress the world, wouldn't he? Yes. He'd want to show that his greatness is greater than anything that we could ever imagine. All right, and then this is Joseph's journey. Did I go too fast? Sorry. I thought it was already marked. Well, hurry up. What's taking you so long? Yeah, I don't see them up there.
Kadesh.
I didn't draw this map.
So
Kadesh, Provo.
from Kadesh to Haran.
Kadesh to where?
Haran. Or.
Red dotted line.
Right
Yeah.
between the black.
Okay.
The bottom line.
That's where they were headed, but God sent them back.
I see them there at the bottom.
That's where they should have gone, but their stupidity. Yes, sir.
No, you didn't hear this a while ago, but somebody sitting behind me that's a little older, a little wiser than you, you said you're getting older, so you're getting a little frank.
Uh-huh.
She said that's no excuse.
That is no. You know what an excuse is? It's the skin of a reason stuffed with a lie. So you're right. There's no excuse to be grumpy just because you get a little older.
The tan line represent.
That's another view of where they might have gone, but I don't know where they get that from. Or it could be Joseph's. No, not Joseph. I don't know what that's on.
Well, actually, it may be the shortest route to Canaan, but they had to wander.
Yeah, you wonder why they ended up on that side. The shortest trip would have been to go up through Kadesh, Barnea, and right into the promised land. But that's,
Now, their GPS probably said, no, this is the fastest route.
yeah,
Yeah. And it was a big trail.
they messed up because they didn't believe God could accomplish what he said he could accomplish.
Maybe God intended them to be on the east side so that they can go across the river Jordan.
Yeah.
And then into Jericho.
Well, that's what they ended up doing,
I
for sure.
mean, maybe it was God's intention for them to go that way. Anyway, but they had to wander somewhere down here.
Yeah, if they had gone the way they were supposed to, then they would have been on the west side of the city.
40 years earlier.
Right. Can you imagine having to know that for 40 years you were wandering, that you were going to have to do that till you died? And then you missed out on the promised land? What a constant reminder. Of course, the next generation would also should stand as a warning that if God says to do something, you better do it right now the way he says to do it. And they even had a little bit of doubt, even when Joshua said, as for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord, whether they would really serve the Lord or not. Everybody done? How about back at the back? Are you all done? Okay, are you done?
I've been waiting.
Oh, okay, good. All right, the next one is just Joseph's journey. Yeah. It's already on there, so you don't have to do anything. And all the other ones are help you with what we've covered concerning the nation, the kingdom of Saul. It's kind of hard to see on the map the growth of these kingdoms, but you can kind of see in black and white. It's much better in color than it is in black and white. The kingdom of Saul, not huge. David expands it quite a bit, all the way over to the Mediterranean Sea and all the way south, past the line of the Philistines, below the Red Sea, Dead Sea, I mean. And then we have under Solomon, it stretches farther north. Remember, God told them that they could land going all the way to Tigris, or to the Euphrates, all the way down to the Wadi of Egypt. And so they finally owned all of that, or settled all of that, finally under Solomon. Solomon, to me, is one of the most interesting of all the kings because he had everything that he could possibly need and want, and still he was never satisfied. But yet God saw in him, in the choice that he made for wisdom, saw something in Solomon that was excellent. But it was his wives, foreign wives, that got him into trouble. That's a good illustration to use with your children on marrying only in the Lord. Is if you marry outside of the family of God, there's no telling what that person will lead you to do. There's not anybody that has more influence over you than you. It's hard to get along with. It's even harder, isn't it? All right, and then we have we can see how it's all one part. And then the divided kingdom, we see that it's divided into those two parts. All right, so y'all keep that for your records, and you can refer back to them as we go through each one of these. All right, 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel. We're down at the point of the United Kingdom. 1 Samuel chapter 9 down through 2 Samuel chapter 24. We also read about these same things in 1 Chronicles chapter 1 through 2 Chronicles chapter 9. After the period of the judges, anarchy again prevailed. And they began to say, we want a king, we want a king, we want a king, we want a king. Samuel actually revived the institution of prophecy in Israel, giving guidance in the right way for individual Israelites to live. But that didn't work so well for national guidance. They wanted a king. When Samuel was old, basically the people began to reject God's rule in favor of being like the nations round about them. We want to have a king like them. And God warned them through the prophecy of Samuel. He says that the kind of king that you want is going to oppress you. He's going to tax you. He's going to take your children. He's going to put you under great oppression. But that didn't seem to change their mind. They still stubbornly insisted on having a king. So they were going from a theocracy, where God is the ruler, to a monarchy, where they have a king. But it's still a little different because even though they have a king, the prophet is the one who speaks for God, and he's the one that brings the law to the people, and the king is supposed to obey the prophet. So really, the prophet has more authority than does the king. Samuel anoints Saul as the king of Israel, as God told him to. And Saul started off pretty humble as a young man. He began his rule well by delivering the people of Jabesh Gilead from the Ammonites and treating them with gracious leniency. The Israelites who had opposed his rule, he was good to them. But then Saul begins a series of presumptuous sins caused by, guess what? That big P word, pride. Pride and stubbornness, and it led to his fall. First, he was hard-pressed by the Philistines. Samuel had not arrived at Gilgal to offer sacrifice to God, and Saul took it upon himself to do it. How presumptuous is that, to step in the place of the priest and the prophet of God? That was not, you can't act as a priest if you're not part of the priestly lineage. Then he made the foolish command that, had it been carried out, would have caused the death of his brave and righteous son Jonathan. He doesn't care. The last straw comes when Samuel directs Saul to destroy all of the Amalekites. And Saul kept their king. Do you remember what the king's name was? Agag or Agag? I don't know which way you'd want to say that. He also kept back the best of the flocks, the best of the herds, claiming that he was going to sacrifice all of those to the Lord. I wonder if they'd ever really made it to the sacrificial hill. Probably not. Probably not. When Saul refused to admit his sin, this is what Samuel says in Samuel chapter 15, verses 22 and 23. He says, "As the Lord has great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in obeying the voice of the Lord, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, to heed than the fat of ram. For rebellion," it's interesting here, "for rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft." Wow. Witchcraft was in league with Satan himself. And he says, "And stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, God has rejected you from being the king." Well, Samuel mourned for Saul, but the Lord directed Samuel to anoint another king to replace him. And God selected the tallest, best-looking man in all of Jesse's household, right? No, that's who Samuel thought it should be. Look at him. He fits the bill. He's head and shoulders above the rest. But God said no. And finally, after he paraded all his sons before, Samuel says, "Do you have anyone else? Are you sure?" "Well, yeah, we have our little punky kid, David, who's out tending the sheep. Certainly you don't mean him." And sure enough, that was the one. Why? The Bible describes David as a man after God's own heart. He had a heart for serving the Lord. And we see that demonstrated as he fights the lion, he fights the bear. We see him dependent totally upon God. And then when Saul should have defeated the Philistines, and remember Goliath comes out and Goliath calls and says, "Send out your best guy." Nobody would go, not even Saul. Saul, who is head and shoulders above everybody else in Israel, he doesn't even go out and fight him. And here's little David. David comes in and says, What's the deal with the big dude down there yelling out at us, telling us that God is not going to supplant him at all?" And Saul says, "Go away, kid. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know how rough this guy is." And David said, we've got to fight this man. We've got to take him down. I'll do it myself. And so remember that he gives him his own armor, which is ridiculous. Because, Saul apparently was kind of considered a giant because he was so much bigger than everyone else. And David was still kind of a shepherd boy. And he probably couldn't even lift up all of that armor, let alone walk around and work with it. The Bible said he had not proven the armor. When you get a set of armor, you have to work in it for a long time to get used to being able to move around in the stuff, let alone carry it, build up your muscles to be able to carry it around. No. And Saul loved David after he kills Goliath. David becomes Saul's armor bearer, and that's pretty close ties. You're going to hear everything that the king has to say, being the next to the king all the time. What kind of courage would it have taken for David to stand before Goliath himself? I mean, that had, it's a different, I guess it's different than fighting a bear. I wouldn't want to do that either. Or fight a lion. I wouldn't want to do that either.
I think the
here's
faith
someone
made
who's a
the
proven
courage.
Killer. Yes, sir?
The faith made the courage.
Yeah. His courage was, he said, when Goliath basically said, you come at me with a stick, and you am I a dog? And remember that David said, I didn't come by my own power. I came by the power of the great God of heaven. And he will smite you. He will take you down. Why do you think that David knew that he was going to be successful? How many stones did he take? Why 5? You think maybe Goliath had some brothers? He was ready to go the distance, no matter what it would take. That if Goliath was not enough, he would take down the next giant and the next giant and the next giant until the work was done. There's a picture in one of the child's books that I had when I was a little kid, a picture of David trying to lift up the sword to behead Goliath, and he's barely big enough to lift up that sword. The sword is bigger than he is, and yet he was not afraid of him at all. 1 Samuel 17, verses 45 through 47. David kills the heavily armed giant warrior with a stone from his slingshot. God directed that stone. Now, a slingshot is not this. We call that a wrist rocket now. Some people call it even uglier words.
Bean flip.
Huh?
We call it bean flip.
Bean flip. But this was more, they called it a shepherd's sling. And oftentimes it was just one big long piece of string with a pouch at the end for a stone. But some, and they still use them today, have that same sling tied to a stick, a long staff. And they could take that and sling it like this, and it's deadly accurate. Slinging it around like this would be harder than slinging it straight on at somebody like that. So if you look on the internet, look for shepherd's sling, and it shows something a little different than what we've always considered. And it may have been the round and around his head it went, but I'm thinking it might have been the shepherd's sling, because it would have attached to his staff and rod, since he was a shepherd. David then becomes a captain in Saul's army and behaves very wisely. The Israelite women begin to praise David above Saul. Saul becomes jealous. He becomes wary of David, and he does everything he can to set out to kill young David. Thus, David, for many years, is a fugitive, and he has to gather his own army of basically rabble-rousers who would defect and come in to work with him. This lasted until King Saul and 3 of his sons, including Jonathan, David's best friend, were killed by the Philistines in a showdown battle at Mount Gilboa. Saul reigned for 40 years, including a number of years after David was the rightful king. I've always wondered why God allowed Saul to keep going even after David was anointed as king. I've always wondered that. But the Bible doesn't say, and I don't guess it really matters if we know what reason that was or not. So the Lord allows Israel to have the king they wanted. And guess what? That first king failed them miserably. And so now God picks out the king, a king after his own heart, David. Judah anointed David as the king of Hebron, but Ishbosheth, that's a hard name to say, the son of Saul and the pawn of Saul's general Abner, claimed to be the king of Israel. Finally, Abner turns against Ishbosheth, and Ishbosheth's own servant murders her. And David is then anointed as king of Israel. And he's seated on the throne. David takes Jerusalem from the Jebusites and he makes it his capital. No longer is it Bethlehem. From here, or from there, he leads an army of victorious soldiers over the Philistines. He then brings back the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, where he erected a new tabernacle. David wanted to build the temple to God, but because there was so much blood on David's hands that God told him he would not be able to do that. But his son would be able to do that. So Nathan tells him through, or God tells David this through Nathan the prophet. He promised David that a descendant of his would reign on the throne of the Lord forever. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 through 16. So from now on, we see that the Messiah, who would come from Abraham's loins, Isaac, Jacob, then we see now that he's going to be from David, the king, the tribe of Judah. So we've narrowed down this lineage of where Jesus would come from. God had not forgotten that he promised Abraham 1,000 years earlier that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through his seed. And so Jesus comes through both Abraham and David. And that's why we have that record in the book of Matthew going back to David and then back to Abraham. Luke takes him all the way back to Adam. David conquered all of the foes of Israel on every side. He's a great and mighty warrior. He ruled over the land of God and promised that God had promised to Abraham. And when David became great, he committed great sins. Isn't that amazing how sometimes when we get to be most successful, we forget about God and forget about what God is wanting us to do? So maybe success is not the best thing in the world. When you think about it, Saul, the Apostle Paul, Saul, he was destined to be the greatest among all men in the Jewish nation. But he's not a success anymore after he begins to follow Jesus, not in that kind of success. But God blesses him beyond measure, spiritually. When the prophet Nathan charged David with the sins against Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah, David, how does he respond? He repents. We see him tremendously grieved by what he had done. Even though God forgave David, he still had to pay a price for the terrible sins that he had committed. We see that the son that was born to Bathsheba dies. Then his son Absalom leads a rebellion against David, and he's killed by David's commander Joab. So David's life is filled with a lot of pain and sorrow and death. David was guilty of great sins, but he was a great man of faith in God. And even though these bad things still happened because of his sin, he stayed faithful to God. Under David, Israel had what it needed as a nation, the rule of a righteous king. When David finally got things back right, he did things right. Israel came to the height of its power and its glory as a nation. So David was also known as the sweet psalmist of Israel. 2 Samuel chapter 23 and verse 1. David writes a lot of songs, a lot of poetry. Some of the most beautiful ones are written during the time that Saul is chasing him. Some of the other ones are beautiful, but like Psalm 51, talking about his repentance and change. What a beautiful psalm Psalm 51 is. The Psalms beautifully express some of the deepest emotion of the soul, especially praise to God and longing for fellowship with God. One thing I ask of you is that I may dwell in the house of the Lord forever. What a beautiful thing that would be. Is there any passage more comforting in any time of trouble than the 23rd Psalm? Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Your rod, your staff, they comfort me. What a beautiful thing. And I think out of the hundreds of funerals that I've done over the years, probably 75%, if not more, have requested that we read the 23rd Psalm because it brings them comfort. I think it's because David himself was a shepherd and he knew how much the shepherd loves the sheep. Though David could not build the temple, the house of God, he drew the plans for its construction and designed the worship connected with it, and he begins to gather the material for the construction of it. David rules on the throne for 40 years. David oversees the coronation of his son Solomon as the king in his place. Soon after Solomon ascends to the throne, God appears to him in a dream and told him to ask whatever he desired. And rather than ask for victory, wealth, fame, Solomon was humble and he asked for wisdom to rule God's people well. Man, that says a lot about a young man. God was pleased with the request and promised him more wealth and more wisdom than he could ever hold. Solomon became the wisest and the wealthiest man in the entire world, perhaps ever at any time. They say that during Solomon's rule, that over 12 tons of gold alone, not counting silver and other precious metals and diamonds and those things, 12 tons of gold came in to the kingdom every year for those 40 years. Now that's a rich king if there ever was one. After he built the temple, and he used a lot of that gold to build the temple, what did he do after he built the temple? He built his own palace. And it was amazing. It was an amazing building. It may not have compared completely with the temple, but it was on up there. Israel had peace and prosperity really throughout the 40-year reign of Solomon. The people came from many nations round about to see, to marvel at the wealth and the wisdom of this man, Solomon. Remember the story of the Queen of Sheba came from southern Arabia and was overwhelmed by the wealth and wisdom of such a man. But Solomon had a problem. He had a woman. His queen was the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt, and she brought her gods with her he gathered a harem of over 1,000 wives. I don't know how wise that was. How could you ever think that you could keep 1,000 wives happy? There's just no way. There's just no way. But those were not necessarily sexual unions or even to have children, but they were more of a way to make league with foreign nations. So if you were the king of a foreign land and your daughter is married to the king of Israel, you're probably not going to launch an attack against it. But the sad thing is that all of these foreign wives and concubines, they brought their gods with them. And again, these pagan wives were the undoing of Solomon and Israel, because they introduced idolatry into Israel and even turned Solomon himself to become idolatrous. I wonder if Solomon ever turned back completely. I wonder if Proverbs was written early in his life, or if it was written very late in his life, and he had turned his life back toward God. I don't know.
I mean, that's my opinion.
But you know, the things that Solomon did in his old age actually sowed the seed that germinates into division of his kingdom and eventually the falling away and destruction of Israel. It can be traced back to these leagues and God punishing them for that. All right, so then the Lord promised Jeroboam, Solomon's servant, that he would be able to take away the tribes of the north, and then Rehoboam would take the tribes of the south too. All right. Who has Devo tonight? Is it Larry? Larry, you had it last week, didn't you?
I don't have another one today.
Is anybody up for it tonight? Hunter, you want to do it?
Nope.
Boy, his eyes opened up bigger than I've ever seen. What's the invitation song?
913.
You want to turn this light on? Somebody that's sitting over there close. Turn in your Bibles to the little book of Colossians. If there's ever a book that talks about the supremacy of Jesus Christ, it has to be the book of Colossians. Notice with me in chapter 1. And let's just read for a moment, beginning in verse 15 of chapter 1, book of Colossians. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in all things hold together. In him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. So he's telling us that Jesus is the greatest of all. When you think about God sending his best, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9, that he sent the riches of heaven to become poor on this earth. So that why? So that we might become rich. That we might lose our poverty and become rich in Jesus Christ. He is above all, through all, and in all. He is the great God of the Old Testament found in the New Testament. He's the great I am. How many times does Jesus use the term I am? I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. I am the resurrection. I am the beginning. I am the end. I am Alpha. I am Omega. Over and over again, Jesus uses that term I am, and that's not an accident at all. Jesus is identifying himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's the same God. And Jesus was in the beginning with God. Turn in your Bible over to Hebrews chapter 1. Notice that he says in chapter 1, verse 1, long ago in many times and in many ways God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom, what? Also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. That's the same thing that Paul is saying back here in Colossians chapter 1. He is the cohesion of all things. By him, all things hold together. What does Peter say is going to happen at the end of the world? Everything is going to melt with a fervent heat. Everything's going to fly apart. Everything is going to become chaos once again, except for the new heavens, the new earth. Everything else is going to be totally demolished in the great fire that God puts forth. But Jesus is the one that's going to make that happen when he returns. Are you ready for that? Are you ready for if Jesus would come back today? Are you ready to meet him, knowing that he holds the key to heaven and he holds the key to hell? And it's up to you to be obedient to him, for him to allow you to go to one or the other. If not, tonight's the night to change that. Tonight is to accept Jesus as your Savior through baptism and obedience to his will. If you've wandered away from God, he says that we have to be faithful. How far? Revelation 2 and verse 10. All the way to death. So we cannot give up. We have to keep working every day to be pleasing to God. How are you doing? If you need to respond, would you do so while together we stand and sing?
Come to Jesus,
He will save you, though your sins as crimson glow. If you give your heart to Jesus, he will make it white as snow. Come to Jesus, come to Jesus, come to Jesus, come today. Come to Jesus, come to Jesus, come to Jesus, come today. Come to Jesus, dying Savior, a Savior there is none. He will share with you his glory when your pilgrimage is done. Come to Jesus, come today, come to Jesus, come today, come to Jesus, come today, come today, come to Jesus, come today, come to Jesus, come today, come to Jesus, come today.
All right, guys, y'all ready?
480, 480, first and last stanzas. I heard
No story, how the Savior came from glory, how he gave his life on Calvary to save a wretch like me. I've heard about his groaning, of his precious blood has known me. Then I repented of my sins and won the victory. Oh, victory in Jesus, my
bought me with his redeeming blood. He loved me ere I knew him, and all my love is to him. He launched me to victory beneath the cleansing flood. I heard about a mansion he has built for me in glory, and I heard about the street of gold beyond the crystal sea. I'll have the angels singing and the old redemption story, and some sweet day I'll sing of them a song of victory. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior forever. He sought me and bought me with his redeeming blood. He loved me ere I knew him, and all my love is to him. He plunged me to victory beneath the cleansing flood.
652, 652. First, second, and third sentence. 652.
Do I lift up my soul unto thee, O Lord? Do I lift up my soul, oh my God? I trust in thee. Let me not be ashamed, let not my enemies triumph over me. Get them that way. Only be ashamed. Get them that way. Only be ashamed. Oh my God, I trust in thee. Oh, let me not be ashamed. Let not my enemies triumph over me. Remember not the sins of my youth. Remember not the sins of my youth. Oh my God, I trust in thee. Oh, let me not be ashamed. Triumph over me.
$394. 394. He took my burdens all away up to a brighter day. He gave me a song, a wonderful song, a wonderful song I never can sing. In my joy bells ring. He gave me a song, a wonderful song. He gave me a song
To sing about.
He lifted me from sin and now to praise his name. He is my King, a wonderful song. He is to me. I am redeemed, no more to die, never to say goodbye. He gave me a song, a wonderful song. He stays in that present. Sing the chorus, and he gave me a song, a wonderful song. He gave me a song to sing aloud. He lifted me from sin and out, oh praise his name. He is my King, a wonderful song. He is to me.
Who do we need to put on the prayer list? Archie's doing pretty well. He came through his heart cath very well. They found very little blockage. In fact, the doctor, when he came out, actually said, when I get to be as old as that guy, I hope my veins are in as good a shape as his. And but he said that there is some blockage, about 20% in a few arteries. He said they'll treat that with just baby aspirin. So be praying for that. But he's still having this breathing issue. So they're going to send him to a lung specialist to see if they can find out what's causing that. Somebody said that's just because he's 85. I don't know if that's the case or not. But be praying for Archie and for one. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, Kim's gonna have surgery September the 1st, so we wanna keep those prayers going
Yes.
for her, okay?
Hey, Joe, I can say something. So, we're very grateful for God for what he has done. I mean, God answers prayers, but Kim just want me to tell you that she does have a lump, but they can remove it. It's caught early enough that everything should be fine. So we're very thankful for that. But still have to have oncology look at everything, but should be good. So like she asked, keep her in prayers. But I do want to call out a couple of people here. Larry, Mary, and Tina have got some wonderful daughters. And they make good cookies too. But Kim was very thankful they come over and see her. So, ladies, thank you. Appreciate it.
How sweet. I went in for a stress test. They won't tell you anything yet, but apparently it wasn't too awful bad because they let me take both days of it, day one and day two. So be thinking of that. I go in for the next level of shots in my back, going in tomorrow to see if they're going to go further with that, or if we can just go ahead with the ablation. We'll just have to see. Pray that they get rid of this pain. I'm tired of it. So, anything else? It's good to have Brother Adams. I understand you're from Seymour.
Yes.
You know, you can always see more in Seymour.
I suppose you can see less.
Yeah, I know a lot of people from Seymour. Spent some
Where's
time.
that
My wife's grandmother was the funeral director person there for a long time.
What's it close to?
But nothing,
Oh,
nothing.
Other side
There,
of the
it's close to Albany. If that helps, if you know where Albany is, it's right there close by.
Jenny's from Holiday.
Yeah, not too far from Holiday. Who's from Holiday? You're from Holiday?
Me.
Oh, really?
I know where Seymour is.
That's
I love
right.
it. It's for holiday. Holiday's about this big.
Yes.
Oh, yeah,
it's
there's
little
several
bit.
more lights there around.
Yes.
But I love it still.
My ninth grade Spanish teacher, Romy Wilson, is.
Okay. Be praying for Romy Wilson. Thank you for making that known.
Joe,
Yes.
we're gonna head up to 4-H at the visitation for my cousin, told you the little 38-year-old girl skills program.
That's
So we're gonna drive up to Whitesburg tomorrow evening and then back, so.
Stangley's are going to San Angelo? San Antonio. So be praying for them because she had an uncle that passed. So be praying for them. Uncle or
cousin.
Cousin. Uncle, cousin, double cousin, wow. Not sure how that works, but. Brother Tony, would you mind leading us in a closing prayer?
Dear Father, thank you today you give us come to worship you. Thank you for our elders, deacons, and teachers. Young people, watch over them, keep them safe and well, please. Thank you for visitors tonight. Be with us throughout this week coming, we'll be safe. Forgive us for our sins. In Jesus' name, pray. Amen.
I've got several of them.
Is that where two brothers marry two sisters?